At 10:15 in the morning on August 4, 1943, Captain Thomas Magguy sat in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, staring at a silver speck in the sky that he despised more than malaria. He was 25,000 feet above the lush, decaying jungles of New Guinea, suspended in the thin, bitterly cold air of the stratosphere. His engines were howling, the needles on his gauges buried deep in the yellow, and the entire airframe trembled like a drenched dog. Yet the silver speck was shrinking. It drifted farther away, climbing higher, moving with an effortless elegance that made Magguy want to smash his instrument panel. The speck was a Mitsubishi Ki-46, known to the Allies as the Dina. It was the finest reconnaissance aircraft the Japanese Empire ever produced. It wasn't built to fight. It was built to escape. It was sleek, streamlined, and fast, designed to operate at 35,000 feet, where the air was so thin that most American fighters would stall and tumble from the sky like stones. For months, the Dina had been the phantom of the Pacific. It appeared over Allied airfields every morning at precisely the same time, snapping photographs, charting supply routes, and counting bombers. The Japanese crews knew they were beyond reach. They flew in straight, confident lines, taunting the Americans clawing for altitude beneath them. Engines overheating, struggling desperately to close the distance before gravity claimed them. Magguy shoved his throttle forward, pushing the levers past the detent, pleading with the twin Allison engines for more power. He felt the surge and then the unavoidable shudder. The turbochargers were choking. The manifold pressure gauge hovered at the red line, 44 inches of mercury. The manual warned that if he forced it beyond 44, the cylinder heads would tear apart. The manual warned the pistons would liquefy into slag. The manual warned the engine would become a grenade. So the automatic regulators intervened, bleeding off pressure, strangling the engine to save it from destruction. The P-38 lunged, then sagged. The nose dipped. The Dina flew on undisturbed, vanishing into the pale haze of the horizon. Magguy banked his heavy fighter left and began the long, humiliating descent back toward the mud of Maryland Airfield. This was not merely a failed interception. It was a daily ceremony of humiliation. The American pilots were flying the most advanced fighter in the world, a twin-engine beast armed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose. It was meant to be the ruler of the sky. But against the high-altitude Dina, it was a muscle car chasing a starship. The Japanese knew it. The Americans knew it. And the mechanics on the ground, who spent their nights patching bullet holes in planes too slow to evade danger, knew it best of all. When Magguy taxied into his revetment, the jungle's heat struck him like a physical blow. New Guinea wasn't merely hot. It was a steam bath. The humidity rotted leather boots within a week and coated glass lenses with mold overnight. Master Sergeant Frank Papy Miller stood by the wheel chock, a rag in his hand and resignation written across his grease-smeared face. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could hear it in the ticking of the engines as they cooled, the metal settling after being driven to its limit. He could see it in the way Magguy hurled his helmet onto the wing. The Dina had escaped again. Miller climbed onto the wing, wiping a streak of hydraulic fluid from the cowling. He studied the massive turbocharger mounted on the boom behind the engine. It was an engineering marvel. A turbine spun by hot exhaust gases that rammed compressed air into the engine, letting it breathe at high altitude. In theory, it granted the P-38 limitless power. In reality, it was restrained. The Army Air Corps engineers back at Wright Field had determined that 44 inches of manifold pressure was the safe threshold. They had installed a wastegate regulator, a mechanical nanny that automatically opened a valve to dump excess pressure whenever the pilot became too aggressive. It was a safeguard meant to keep the engines alive for hundreds of hours. But Sergeant Miller didn't care about engine lifespan. He cared about pilot lifespan. He had watched capable men lift off and return defeated, or fail to return at all, because they couldn't climb quickly enough to evade a trap. He understood that 44 inches was a peacetime figure. It was calculated by men in white lab coats sitting in climate-controlled offices in Ohio. It was not calculated for a dogfight at 30,000 feet above a jungle where the enemy held every advantage. Miller rested his hand on the hot aluminum skin of the Lightning. He looked at the regulator valve. It was nothing more than a spring and a lever. A simple mechanical device standing between his pilot and victory. That night, the jungle filled with the hum of insects and the distant roll of thunder. Officers sat in their tents drafting reports and sipping warm beer, grumbling about the Dina. But on the flight line, the lights still burned. Sergeant Miller and a small group of crew chiefs gathered around the left engine of Maguire's Lightning. They were not conducting routine maintenance. They were committing sabotage, at least that's what the technical manual would have called it. The cowling panels were removed, revealing the intricate plumbing of the turbocharger system. Miller held a wrench in one hand and a length of heavy-gauge safety wire in the other. He wasn't consulting the manual. He had thrown the manual in the trash. Weeks earlier, he was studying the wastegate linkage. The regulator functioned by sensing manifold pressure and opening the gate to bleed off excess boost when it rose too high. Miller's plan was simple and terrifying. He intended to mechanically lock the gate. He was going to bypass the regulator completely. In a low, gravelly voice, he explained the physics to the other mechanics. If they tightened the spring and wired the gate shut, the pilot would have full manual control of the pressure. There would be no safety net, no automatic bleed-off. If Magguy pushed the throttle forward, the turbo would spin faster and faster. The pressure wouldn't stop at 44 inches. It would climb to 50, 60, maybe even 70. It would cram so much air and fuel into the cylinders that the engine could produce nearly twice its rated horsepower. It would transform the P-38 into a rocket. But there was a catch, a serious one. If the pilot held that power for more than a few minutes, or failed to watch his temperature gauges with absolute focus, the engine wouldn't merely overheat. It would detonate. The cylinder heads would rip free from the block and blast through the engine cowling like artillery shells. The younger mechanics shifted uneasily. They had been trained to follow procedures. They had been taught that the red line on a gauge was law. Crossing it meant a court-martial. Miller stared at them, his knuckles pale as he gripped the wrench. He reminded them the Dina would return tomorrow at 10 o'clock. He reminded them the Zeros would be waiting in the sunlight. He told them an engine could be replaced. Pilot could not. Then he asked whether they wanted to write another letter to a mother in Ohio explaining why her son would never come home. The men stopped hesitating. They lifted their tools. They got to work. They adjusted the tension springs on the wastegates, tightening them until the metal creaked. They twisted heavy safety wire with pliers, locking the regulators closed. They rerouted the control cables, bypassing the automatic limiters entirely. It was rough work. It was hot rodding in its purest form, the kind of modification a teenager makes to a jalopy to win a drag race, applied to a multi-million-dollar warplane. When they finished, the engines looked unchanged from the outside. But within, they were ticking bombs of stored power. They sealed the cowlings, wiped grease from the rivets, and stepped back. The sun rose on August 5th with the same suffocating heat and blinding glare. Captain Magguy walked toward his aircraft, dragging his parachute behind him. He looked exhausted. He expected another futile pursuit of ghosts. Sergeant Miller met him at the ladder. He didn't salute. He leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial murmur. He told the captain the aircraft was different today. He told him the red line on the manifold pressure gauge was now only a suggestion. He explained that the wastegates had been wired shut. He warned him he would have about 5 minutes of emergency power before the engines turned into molten aluminum. But during those 5 minutes, he would have enough thrust to climb a vertical wall. Magguy studied the mechanic. He saw the grease beneath Miller's fingernails. He understood what the man had done. He had risked his career and likely a prison sentence to give him a fighting chance. Magguy said nothing. He simply nodded, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He climbed into the cockpit and strapped in. He started the engines. They ignited with a roar that sounded deeper, throatier than before. The idle was uneven. The gauge needles twitched anxiously. The beast was no longer restrained. Magguy taxied to the runway. He advanced the throttles for takeoff. Normally, the P-38 gained speed smoothly. Today it lunged. The acceleration shoved him into his seat. The manifold pressure needle swept past 40, past 44, and continued rising. The ground vanished beneath him. He was airborne in half the usual distance. He retracted the gear and aimed the nose skyward. He climbed to 20,000 feet in record time, the engine screaming a new, frightening pitch. He leveled off and waited. He glanced at his watch. 9:55. The Dina was late, but something else was coming, high above him, concealed in the glare of the sun. The trap had been laid. The Japanese commander spotted the solitary P-38 below and signaled his flight. 5 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros dipped their wings and began their descent. They were the wolves. The heavy American fighter was the prey. They expected the American to turn, to bleed off speed, to become a slow, heavy target. They didn't realize the prey had grown fangs. They didn't know the mechanic on the ground had just rewritten the limits of physics. Mad Guy caught the flash of sunlight on a canopy overhead. He didn't dive. He didn't flee. He rammed the throttles forward to the firewall and yanked the stick back toward his chest. The test had begun. The physics of a turbocharged aircraft engine are harsh but straightforward. As an airplane climbs, the air thins. With less oxygen to burn, the engine loses power. It begins to suffocate. To solve this, engineers bolted a massive turbine to the rear of the Allison engine. The turbocharger spins at 20,000 revolutions per minute, drawing in thin air, compressing it until it becomes dense and heavy, then forcing it down the engine's intake. It acts as an artificial lung, allowing the aircraft to breathe at high altitude. But there is danger. Force too much air into the cylinders and the pressure rises so violently that it can literally tear the cylinder heads from the engine block. It is like inflating a balloon with a fire hose. To prevent disaster, engineers installed regulators to limit that pressure. To prevent that catastrophe, the engineers installed the wastegate. It was a safety valve, a mechanical conscience that sensed when pressure climbed too high and vented the excess air overboard. Kept the engine safe. Kept the pilot alive. Kept the warranty intact. But Master Sergeant Miller had decided that safety was a luxury they could no longer afford. When he wired the wastegates shut, he lobotomized the engine. He stripped away its ability to refuse. Now, as Captain Maguire shoved the throttles forward at 25,000 feet, the turbochargers were spinning wildly beyond control, forcing an insane volume of air into the combustion chambers. The manifold pressure gauge, supposed to halt at 44 inches, swept past 50, then 55, then 60. The sensation inside the cockpit was terrifying. The P-38 didn't merely accelerate, it convulsed. The entire airframe vibrated as the twin propellers clawed at the air with nearly 3,000 combined horsepower. It felt as if the aircraft were trying to tear itself apart. The vibration blurred the instrument needles into gray streaks. Heat from the engines radiated upward through the floorboards, scorching Magwie's boots. He was riding a bomb in the act of detonating, except the explosion was being redirected into forward thrust. He watched the oil temperature begin to climb. He understood he was consuming the engine's lifespan not in hours, but in seconds. High above, the pilot of the Japanese Dina observed the American fighter climbing. He wasn't concerned. He had seen this spectacle 100 times. The P-38 was heavy and cumbersome. It would climb sharply for a few thousand feet. Then the laws of thermodynamics would assert themselves. The American engines would choke, the nose would dip, and the P-38 would stall out, leaving the Dina alone in the stratosphere. The Japanese pilot checked his altimeter. 30,000 feet. He was secure. He banked his sleek silver aircraft gently left, preparing to photograph the struggling American below. It was an act of supreme arrogance born from total technical superiority. Then he saw something that froze his blood. The American fighter wasn't slowing. It wasn't gasping. It was accelerating. The twin-boom aircraft was slicing through the thin air like a missile, devouring altitude in enormous, hungry gulps. The Dina pilot shoved his throttles forward, attempting to escape. But the Dina was a thoroughbred racehorse, while the modified P-38 was a dragster with the governor torn off. The distance shrank from 2 miles to 1 in seconds. The Japanese pilot realized too late that the rules had changed. The predator that had chased him for months had suddenly grown wings. Maguire felt the G-forces pinning him into his seat as the P-38 clawed up to 30,000 feet. Now he was level with the Dina. He saw sunlight flashing off the Japanese canopy. He saw the pilot's head snapping around in panic. Maguire felt no triumph, only a cold, mechanical fury. This was the aircraft that had humiliated his squadron. This was the plane that had charted their airfields and counted their dead. He flipped the safety cover from the gun switch. The P-38 carried 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon mounted in the nose. It was a chainsaw built to slice airplanes apart. He centered the silver speck in his gun sight. The Dina tried to dive, a desperate attempt to gain speed, but you cannot dive away from an aircraft that is already falling upward. Maguire squeezed the trigger. The nose of the Lightning exploded in flame and smoke. The recoil shuddered through the airframe, slowing the aircraft slightly. A violent tremor ran from nose to tail. Streams of tracers and high-explosive shells reached out and struck the Dina. It wasn't a dogfight. It was an erasure. The shells stitched across the Japanese wing root and ripped the starboard engine entirely free. The fuel tanks ignited instantly. The Dina broke apart into a cloud of burning aluminum and thick black smoke, spiraling down toward the emerald jungle far below. Maguire lifted his finger from the trigger. He drew a breath from the canned oxygen flowing into his mask. He scanned his gauges. The coolant temperature needle was pegged. Oil pressure fluctuated wildly. The engines shrieked in protest, begging for mercy. He reached for the throttles to ease back the power to allow the beast to cool. Before he could, a shadow passed over his canopy, a dark shape streaking across the sun. He looked up. The trap had been sprung. The Dina had been bait, high above in the blinding glare. 5 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros rolled inverted and began their dive. They had waited for the American to stall while pursuing the reconnaissance plane. They expected a slow, helpless P-38 hanging vulnerable in thin air, an easy mark for their 20mm cannons. Instead, they found a P-38 traveling nearly 400 miles per hour, already at their altitude. The hunters had cast their net, but the prey had already chewed through the ropes. The situation became a nightmare instantly. 5 Zeros against 1 P-38. In a conventional dogfight, it would be a death sentence. The Zero was light, agile, capable of turning inside almost anything. The P-38 was heavy, with a broad turning radius. If Maguire tried to dogfight them horizontally, they would swarm him like hornets, settle onto his tail, and dismantle him piece by piece. The textbook maneuver for a P-38 in this scenario was to dive. The Lightning's weight gave it superior diving speed compared to the lighter Zero. The standard procedure, the textbook move, was to drop the nose, dive for the deck, and hope you didn't meet the ground first. But Mag-Guy couldn't dive. He was at 30,000 feet, and the Zeros were already coming down on him. If he pushed the nose over now, he would only offer them a huge, easy target. He had to do something they didn't anticipate. He had to do something the manual insisted was impossible. He had to use the one edge Sergeant Miller had given him. He had to go vertical. The Zero dominated the horizontal turn, but its engine was weak in thin air. It choked at altitude. The modified P-38, with its wastegates wired shut, was inhaling fire. Mag-Guy slammed the throttles fully forward and pulled the yoke into his stomach. The heavy fighter didn't bank. Pitched up. It went straight vertical. The nose aimed at the dark blue vault of the sky. G-forces crushed him again, draining blood from his head and narrowing his vision into a gray tunnel. He was wagering his life on brute horsepower. He was betting that his American engines, abused, overdriven, pushed past every safe limit, could overpower the lighter Japanese fighters in a climbing duel. The Japanese pilots stared in disbelief as the big American aircraft rose into a vertical climb that seemed to defy gravity. They yanked back on their sticks, trying to follow. They wanted the kill. They were hungry for it. For a few seconds, the Zeros stayed with him, their lighter weight allowing them to leap upward. Then the atmosphere asserted its rules. The air was too thin. The Japanese engines, lacking the massive turbochargers of the P-38, began to starve. They lost thrust. They lost lift. Their aircraft started to wobble. Magguy glanced in his rearview mirror. He saw the Zeros beneath him, noses pointed skyward, propellers clawing helplessly at the thin air. They were hanging on their props, bleeding energy every second. But Magguy was still climbing. The manifold pressure held at 60 inches. The engines roared like blast furnaces. He was pulling away. He watched the lead Zero stall. Its nose snapped downward violently as the aircraft shuddered and dropped. Then the second stalled. Then the third. They were like leaves caught in an updraft they couldn't master. This was the moment. The payoff. Magguy was now 2,000 feet above the enemy formation. He sat at the top of the sky. He kicked the left rudder and pushed the throttle on the right engine. The P-38 performed a hammerhead stall, pivoting on a wingtip. The nose sliced downward through the horizon until it pointed straight at the Earth. Gravity, his enemy seconds earlier, was now his ally. He was coming down the mountain, and he was bringing hell with him. The Zeros were scattered below, trying to regain speed, their formation broken. They looked up to see the twin-engine monster diving at them out of the sun. The hunter had become the hunted. Magguy chose the nearest Zero, the flight leader, marked by yellow stripes along the fuselage. The Japanese pilot tried to bank away, but he was too slow, still recovering from the stall. Magguy didn't need to turn. He only needed to aim. He let gravity drive the P-38 to 450 miles per hour. The airframe groaned. The controls stiffened. The oil temperature warning light glowed red on the panel, a sign the engines were beginning to melt internally. He ignored it. He ignored the scent of burning oil filling the cockpit. He focused on the Zero swelling in his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. The 4 machine guns and the cannon thundered together. The stream of fire ripped through the Zero's cockpit. The Japanese fighter didn't burn. It disintegrated. The wings folded inward and the fuselage fell like a stone. Magguy didn't watch it descend. He pulled back on the stick, converting speed into altitude, zoom climbing back to his perch before the remaining Zeros could aim their guns. He was fighting in the vertical, executing a boom and zoom attack, but he was doing it with an engine that should not have existed. He looked down at the 4 remaining Zeros. They circled anxiously, glancing upward, terrified of the predator that kept dropping out of the sun. As Magguy prepared for another pass, the left engine coughed. It was a sharp, violent jolt that shook the aircraft. He checked the gauges. The left manifold pressure needle bounced wildly. Cylinder head temperature was buried deep in the red. The strain was exacting its price. The wastegates were wired shut, but the metal itself was beginning to give way. He had seconds before the engine seized entirely. He was alone, 20,000 feet above the Earth, with 4 hostile Zeros below and an aircraft that was beginning to die. He had a choice: turn for home on one engine or dive back into the fight and try to break them before his own machine broke. He tightened his grip on the stick. He wasn't finished. The warning from the left engine was no subtle shift of a needle. It was a physical rebellion from deep within the machinery. The Allison V1710 was a liquid-cooled engine, a precision instrument, delicate compared to the rugged air-cooled radial engines favored by the Navy. It depended on a complex network of glycol coolant and oil to keep internal temperatures from liquefying the aluminum pistons.